So, to prepare this panel, I was rereading the book published by the two Tapscotts, John and his son Alex, more than 6 years ago on blockchain revolution. Since then, nothing seemed to have changed much as concerns the nature of the two main technological factors driving changes in the financial sector, that is the use of blockchains and artificial intelligence. Clearly, all of this should and would lead to replacing financial intermediaries by smart programs as data created by a distributed blockchains are combined to programs derived from artificial intelligence. And if we believe the Tapscotts, this did and this should in the future lead to private competition, replacing the sovereign monopoly or all the monopolies. But how would that materialize? Would, for example, the private sector, which is full of smart people, ready and eager to replace a whole set of intermediaries, simply make central banks redundant through private digital currencies like Bitcoin or Ethereum and through crypto assets? Well, if so, why have cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin suffered a crisis which brought the Bitcoin price to less than $20,000 recently against 60,000 a few months ago? Or would it be preferable to let central banks keep their sovereign monopoly and issue central banks digital currencies, the CBDCs, instead? After all, central banks can recruit also smart people. And finally, how does that relate to countries? Will the impact of digital currencies be the same everywhere? Or is it history dependent and similar across countries? Or how to relate to CBDCs in developing countries? The answer to the panel question may thus be a little bit more complex than what could have been the case in 2016, the year the blockchain revolution was published. So, to be sure that I would give my full answer to this complicated set of questions, I will give it right away, developing its arguments and giving details only later if needed and if time remains. First, I really believe that in view of Bitcoins and stable coins, recent exchange rate instability, a regulation of stable coins on their reserve funds is certainly necessary to their existence and to their future role. So, sorry for those who believe that state intervention is always a problem. Second, the CBDCs are likely to become a mainstay of central banking, giving access to central bank deposits to almost all citizens. But a few very large and regulated stable coins may exist on the side of national and regional CBDCs. Third, crypto assets will continue developing as fintech's increased influence makes the distinction between banks and not banks increasingly obsolete in a CBDC's world. Indeed, the blockchain will anyway be used to solve issues of record management in a distributed manner. This will make non-banks and banks more and more similar and should allow the general public to benefit from improvements in fintech. Fourth, the impact of CBDCs on growth will not be the same in all countries. It will be most important in developing countries with low financial inclusion and limited use of business-related data. Overall, private competition may increase on assets as banks would concentrate on loans and sovereign monopoly may be widened on short-term deposits. This being said, how do we reach such conclusions? First, I would say by examining what would happen if private digital currencies and the Bitcoin were used for their technological advantages. In the first column, we now see the benefits and the risks of these private digital currencies. Would a perfect world arise as hoped for by the Tapscots? Or would we need to draw consequences, deciding, for instance, that some private currency projects should be abandoned, like Libra or DM recently? And how to cope with exchange rate instability, for instance. Indeed, the big problem with Bitcoin is that its exchange rate is not tethered to any real concept. Indeed, the areas of circulation of a currency have to be well defined for its exchange rate to be defined. If the demands for money in two countries cannot be defined, then the exchange rate of the two concerned currencies, which should be just their ratio, is not defined either. Carrican and Wallace explained it very well in the 80s, but Satoshi Nakamoto did not factor this point in his analysis. Hence, its exchange rate depends mostly on its own expectations, which, although possibly limited in range, are very variable and history dependent. These consequences are shown in the second column. Some are independent of prospective digital currency itself, like the anti-money laundering and KYC measures, which take care or try to take care of scandals such as the hacking of exchange platforms and of money laundering in a clearly imperfect manner, or the preset number of miners out of which clearers are drawn randomly, which takes care of the energy costs of the variable solutions, of the various possible solutions. And finally, third column, in which what is discussed is how some solutions, some consequences may depend on the private or public nature of the digital currency. So you have the exchange rate instability of stablecoins, which implies some sort of tethering through a peg to a basket of international currencies, and a reserve fund for which regulation is needed, or the lender or last resort role of stablecoins, which has to be a notion that we have to devise. Now, these three types of developments can be compared, and what I chose is to try to imagine the world with either CBDCs only or stablecoins only. And you will see very clearly that I prefer a world with CBDCs only, because that's dealing with the issue of having the central bank money green enough, not to spend too much energy, safe enough, and the fact that under CBDCs only, the bank runs are fairly easy to prevent, contrary to what most people say. I think most central bankers would probably agree that it's not impossible to do at all. This would generate an increase in competition between bank and fintechs. So all of this is positive, but there is a but. The problem of central banks is, in my view, that they have been procrastinating a lot up to now, and that when cash is still very much in use, they tend not to accelerate their pace of creation of digital currencies. Second, the stable coins only is possible to imagine, but I would say it needs a lot of development of regulation on reserves, on lender of last resort issues, and that may be too much to ask. So my conclusion is that CBDCs and a few large stable coins might be a practical solution, because this would not mean that stable coins get all data, and some regulation could be usefully derived in order to limit their leeways on that side. And finally, this would allow each country to benefit from the advantages of CBDCs. This leads me now to discuss the factors which may influence or affect CBDC creation. CBDC creation is by definition augmenting financial inclusion. This is mechanical. So this may be worth less if financial inclusion is already there. But on the contrary, augmenting financial inclusion fast may be worse if it's absent. Indeed, financial inclusion is necessary for an access to credit. Financial inclusion impacts growth in least developed countries. This is now well accepted. And it's less important once a given level of development has been reached. And for this, on these 2 points, the example of Kenya and M-Pesa, the connected currency, are usually mentioned. The other point which is interesting is the business-related data that central bank can get and can use if they want, but have not been using at all or sufficiently recently. I think business-related data can help focus advertising campaigns by firms, and therefore they are very useful. And they can inform credit ratings by rating agencies, and they are also quite useful. And in the case of the CBDC, where everybody can participate and get the deposits, then it's quite useful because the figures are much easier to interpret.
Philippe, 5 minutes more.
Okay. So this is a growing market, and this has to be taken into account, but this is mostly through research. The other factors which may affect CBDC creation are policies which can strengthen the impact, like the African Continental Free Trade Area, which was signed recently in 2019, and may be important because it would help a weak spot of developing countries, which is internal trade in Africa. And climate change. Climate change opens opportunities, great deals, and transfers to developing countries. Finally, you have other important impacts like access to electricity grid and to internet. If you don't have electricity, you don't have internet. If you don't have internet, you don't have CBDCs. So these are factors which are 0-1 factors. Finally, you have rating agencies, which would be needed in countries, developing countries, and the fact that monetary unions may maximize the impact of CBDCs. So I think that what we need is to consider the alignment factors which have been more and more apparent, the strengthened position of Africa after the Glasgow conference, the fact that the need to succeed around this area of free trade in Africa is more and more apparent, and the fact that the ECOWAS monetary union is being discussed. ECOWAS is for the western part of Africa, but there are other places where one can imagine some further moves at regional level. Finally, the window of opportunity for such moves, in my view, will be fairly short, because you need to establish regulation and rating agencies, because the role and treatment of business-related data will take time, and because developing the adequate international regulation framework will also be time dependent. Finally, I'm going to end by letting you consider my original conclusions, but adding one, which is that it's certainly time to examine which monetary governance allows the efficient developments in the economy. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, now I will leave the floor to Luca Fantacci, which has been recently appointed as Associate Professor at the University of Milan, and he ran at Bocconi University an observatory on cryptocurrency and money and digital monies in general.
Thank you, Yuri. May I, you're not seeing my slides. Is it possible?
How about you email it to him? He can show it.
No, but I'm sure that they can do that.
Oh, okay.
Can you?
Share the slides.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, we have to be in Zoom this machine.
Oh, okay. So I share them there. Okay, so that.
So I can share it. Share it behind you. I can try.
You're really white it is.
Well, if you share it in the same,
Right? You're very white.
Also.
Okay, now we
great.
can see, and the other one is Philippe.
Okay.
Should be good.
You can see that.
Philippe's and everyone's okay with it. They can read from behind you through the camera.
It's okay. There won't be much written on it anyway. So thank you so much. Okay. As you saw from the schedule, this was intended to be the first presentation. So it was, you will excuse me if there are some introductory remarks. I will try to keep them short. In any case, what I try to do in this presentation is address, as Philippe has done, the main question of the session, namely whether digital currencies open to the competition between private monies or rather they favor a sovereign monopoly in the form of CBDCs. And I do this in historical perspective. Now, the first bit of history that I will be looking at is, in fact, the history of Bitcoin itself. I'm sure you're all familiar with this, but just to lay on the table the main elements of what we are talking about. when Bitcoin was invented, and Philip mentioned the white paper of Satoshi Nakamoto being published in 2008, it was in the midst of the global financial crisis. It was at the time of the bankruptcy of Lehman, rapidly followed by other bankruptcies and by the intervention by governments and central banks to bail out the private banking system. And this is not just the context. This is precisely the reason why the promoters of Bitcoin and more generally of cryptocurrencies laid forth their invention as a challenge to the current state of affairs in money issuance and the management of the payment system. The government bailouts were perceived as a threat for various reasons, quite obvious. For reasons of moral hazard, they encouraged private banks not to take responsibility for their loans. They laid on the balance sheet of the central bank a large part of the financial assets. We were discussing it this morning in another session. And last but not least, they produced inflationary pressures. And today we are witnessing the implications of these lax monetary policies. So in the face of all this, the idea of Satoshi Nakamoto, whoever they are, was to respond to these distortions and to these threats by removing from the hands of the central bankers and the private banking system what is conceived as a public good, namely the possibility of creating money and of transferring money through the payment system, and setting up an alternative in the form of, and here the title of the white paper mentions it explicitly, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. A system of digital cash, which is peer-to-peer, completely horizontal, without any element of hierarchy, without any authority, without any regulation from above. Based on cryptography, so a technological revolution. And Bitcoin is, without any doubt, a technological revolution. I will not spend words on this, but I just want to draw your attention on the dramatic change that Bitcoin has brought in the realm of the digital world that we all experience. We were used to a world of digital objects that were, by definition, replicable. You can copy and paste a file like the presentation I'm sharing, a photo, a film, movie clip, or music, or whatever. Bitcoin is the first digital object which you cannot copy and paste, which is unique, non-modifiable, non-replicable. And this is what makes it plausible to use Bitcoin as money, because these are exactly the kind of characteristics that we associate with money. Is Bitcoin a good currency? By the way, the reason why I'm showing you this, you're probably familiar with this, but this is the front page of the Times on 2 January 2009, and it is quoted in the so-called Genesis block at the beginning of the blockchain. It's still written there, just to sign the date, but also to suggest that there is this relationship between the failure of the official system and setting up a new system. So how is this new system? In a way, it is, even here, a dramatic change. We are used to living in a world still today where you have to constantly choose every time you make a payment, cash or digital payments. We were discussing this the other day at the restaurant, right? And you have this option. Now, what Bitcoin presumes to do is to put these two things together in the form of a digital cash, something, an object that shares the characteristics of cash in terms of anonymity, in terms of the absence of any requirement. The beauty of cash is that it is universally accessible. Anyone can use cash, regardless of whether they have a bank account or any other relationship with intermediaries. The beauty of digital money is that it allows instantaneous payments from one side of the world to the other side of the world for very small amounts or huge amounts, and so on. So imagine having these two things together. In other terms, a digital money, which, unlike the digital money that we are already accustomed to use, does not require the intermediation of any company. Because whenever we use digital money today, there's someone in between, the payer and the payee. Bitcoin says, no, it's peer-to-peer, just me and you. What is the problem from a monetary perspective? And Philippe was already mentioning this. On one side, Bitcoin is produced to be scarce, with a supply which follows this curve and will reach a maximum in a few years of 21 million Bitcoins, which makes Bitcoin similar to gold. This is why it is increasingly described as digital gold. As a monetary historian, I have no hesitation of saying this is a bad idea to reinvent gold. The gold standard was a very problematic monetary system with some advantages, but also several disadvantages, the primary being it was deflationary. You have a fixed amount of money, you cannot accommodate the growth of trade and investments. The other disadvantage, and Philippe already spent a lot of words on this, is instability. And we have witnessed this over the past few months. You remember it was perhaps slightly over a year ago when Elon Musk boasted that Tesla had invested, I believe, $1.5 billion worth in Bitcoin. Since then, the value of Bitcoin tripled, and then it fell back down to the original level, which means I checked that Tesla earned and lost $3 billion, which correspond, they're more than what Tesla has invested in the machinery that they use to produce electronic automobiles. So, I mean, this really tells you how disruptive can be in an ordinary business, not a business like Tesla. Hence, and Philippe was already discussing these stable coins, a second generation of cryptocurrencies that are specifically designed to overcome this major drawback of Bitcoin. How? By pegging their value to essentially an official currency, most of them the dollar. How do they do this? In various ways. I will not go into the details, but essentially there are two different strategies. One type of stable coins are called algorithmic stable coins. And they copy the methods of official currency. So essentially, they try to stabilize the value through what we may call open market operations. The currency is bought and sold against other crypto assets by an algorithm that buys whenever the value goes down and sells whenever the value goes up to try to stabilize it in terms of the dollar. This has never succeeded. Here in the graph, we have one example, which is Nubit. So you can see it was stabilized briefly between 2018 and 2019, and then it collapsed. More recently, a couple of months ago, you may have read about Terra Luna, another stable coin that followed this scheme that collapsed from an overall value of roughly $60 billion to zero in a matter of days. So we have another type of stable coins that are more stable because they have a backing, not in crypto assets, but in financial assets, ideally in cash. Here in this graph taken from a recent report of the IMF, you have what actually backs different types of stable coins. The most widespread is Tether. And you can see that cash is only part of it. Roughly 30%. The rest being other more or less liquid assets like commercial paper or even loans, which is obviously a problem because you might have a bank run, let's say, on Tether asking for a conversion that Tether is not able to provide. The second problem is that there is no transparency. There is no auditing on the actual consistency of these reserves. So these are estimates of the IMF on the basis of what each business is disclosing, but they are not subject. If you wanted a truly stable coin, it wouldn't be a cryptocurrency any longer. You would have to subject these to some kind of regulation that equates a stable coin to electronic money or to bank deposits. So I agree even here with Philip that stable coins are, the future of stable coins is tied to, let's say, reabsorbing them in the official financial systems. Can we rely, and this is at the basis of the question that gives the title to this session, on a form of competition between cryptocurrencies? Along the lines of what had been indeed proposed by Friedrich Hayek back in 1974 at the demise of the Bretton Woods system, when he was advocating for a system, and in this case of national currencies competing among each other, instead of having an authority. Well, something of the sort is already happening. The screenshot here is taken from CoinMarketCap, one of the main websites, where you find a list of the major cryptocurrencies, and you have all the data. You can see the price, market capitalization, and so on. And this gives you an idea that there is a competition going on. These currencies are actually being traded on exchanges. Can we expect this competition to produce a stable currency, reliable as a means of exchange, and all the other functions that we would like to associate to a currency? I am, like Philip, rather skeptical in this respect for various reasons. First, because cryptocurrencies do not correspond to the Hayekian notion of currency competition. When Hayek talks about currency competition, he's talking about businesses competing to produce a stable currency. So you have a manager behind them who is managing the currency precisely with this objective in view. This is not the case with cryptocurrencies. We discussed Bitcoin. There's nobody managing it. There's an algorithm that from the beginning has determined preemptively the curve of the supply. So there's nothing you can do to stabilize the price. The price simply reflects the vagaries of demand and mostly of self-fulfilling expectations, as we have seen in recent months. Other currencies, like Ether, for example, allow for a management, but there's no guarantee that the currency will be managed in view of stabilizing the price. There are many other things that have to be done with the supply of this currency. For example, paying for the developers and promoting the use of the currency in various ways. So I don't have the impression that we are going in that direction. On top of this, I am very skeptical on the very notion of currency competition promoted by Hayek as a way of actually stabilizing the value. Even here, for a simple reason that I will evoke, you cannot distinguish the demand for money for a transactions motive and for a speculative motive. And when you demand a currency for a speculative motive, this peculiar type of demand will not stabilize its price, but it will destabilize it. The increase in the price of a currency is a good reason to increase the demand for that currency. And the increase of demand, in turn, will determine a further increase in the price, which is the opposite of what happens for regular commodities. When the price goes up, the demand will decrease. So it's an explosive and destabilizing equilibrium. And this is what makes central bank digital currencies, thank you, Yuri, desirable and plausible in this scenario. Central bank digital currencies appear on the scene relatively late as a response by central banks to the threat represented by private cryptocurrencies, and more specifically, global stable coins such as Libra that Philippe was mentioning before, for obvious reasons, because if you have a stable coin that can rely on a network of 3 billion users, you have some reasonable expectation of being able to promote the use of this currency. Imagine being able to send money through WhatsApp with the same ease with which you send and share a picture. So central banks react, first, of course, by coordinating a response and blocking the initiative of Facebook in that case, and then producing an alternative, with the purpose of preserving the character of money as a common good. This is what is at stake, I believe. Central bank digital currencies are not just a response to cryptocurrencies. They are prospectively a response to the digitalization of the payment system. For the reasons that I mentioned before, today, all electronic currency is private. If tomorrow we only have digital currencies because they are easier to use, because there's no point today in 2022 in using banknotes and metal coins and these primitive things, we are left only with private money, which means that it's the end of monetary policy. The possibility for the monetary authority to control the quantity of money relies on the fact that there's a distinction between the private bank money produced by the private banking system and the central bank money, which is the ultimate legal tender and the ultimate means of payment with which you pay also those specific types of claims that we conventionally call money, but are in fact bank deposits. So central bank digital currencies are a way to preserve the control of monetary authority on the monetary base and on the monetary system in general. With a risk, of course, because if you introduce a central bank digital currency, and again, Philippe was mentioning this, you run the risk of disintermediating the private banking system. There is an obvious competitive advantage of the central bank in offering an electronic currency. So you can expect depositants to withdraw from private banks and put all their money in the central bank. Why is this a risk? In two respects, because it involves a centralization of the power, and central banks are already almost almighty in the past several years. On top of what they have been able to do so far, this would add a control on data. And again, Philippe was mentioning this, and a threat to privacy, and also a mixture between monetary policy and fiscal policy, because this would allow the central bank to go straight to households and businesses in issuing money, bypassing the private banking system with its traditional function of deciding who gets the money and the allocation of credit. So there's a threat to, let me say, free enterprise, to use a brief definition. So there's a need to, in my view, to redesign a form of cooperation between central banks and commercial banks, between sovereign money and private money. And here I'm drawing to my conclusion, which passes once again through history with a leap backwards to the Renaissance and to that form of early private money, which were trade bills, issued starting from the 15th century as a means of payment for intra-European trade in the form of IOUs that were, let me say, not just a form of private money that merchants would use to pay each other. They were a distributed ledger technology, we could say, because they would be issued to make payments and they would allow the financing of the bulk of intra-European trade, thanks to a form, in this case, however, of centralization at the trade fairs, particularly in Lyon. The reason why I'm mentioning this is because it's interesting. This is a form of private money that performs, we could say, a public function in providing a public service for the payments of long-distance trade in coordination with public authority, which not only authorized these instruments, they granted them an exemption from the jurisdiction. So the fairs were based in Lyon. They would take place every 3 months in Lyon, but they were not subject to French jurisdiction. They would be extraterritorial. And they would allow for a coordination between the public currency and the private currencies. So let me draw my conclusions from here. Sovereign monopoly or private competition? I would say neither, for various reasons. First, because to recognize the public character of money does not imply either the state intervention or a form of monopoly. Public does not necessarily mean state. There can be other forms of governance that are responsible for the issuance and the management of a currency. And it does not necessarily mean monopoly. You can have a plurality of currencies for a plurality of functions, as again, history gives many examples of. On the other hand, to recognize the private character of money does not imply that it is an object of private appropriation in the sense of a store of value that cryptocurrencies have become eminently. This goes back to something I was saying this morning about money being money only in its alienation. Only by giving it away it performs its function. So a private money does not necessarily have to be conceived as a commodity. Again, this morning we were quoting Polanyi, the idea that money is in fact originally not a commodity and not intended to be traded as a commodity on a market.
Here.
Sorry?
Here.
Just as it's not even a conclusion, it's just an indication, a suggestion. I think our current monetary system is already in the form of a public-private partnership. The money that we use comes from a coordination between central authority and private enterprise. And I think that what is at stake is redesigning this partnership, taking advantage of the new technologies, but also bearing in mind the characteristics that we associate to money as a means of exchange and as a unit of account. Thank you.
Sean, you want to have the floor and give some remarks, and after you will open the debate to the room. I think it would be complicated to have people online intervening.
Thank you, Yuri, and thank you, Luca. And I mean, unlike two previous experts, I'm not an expert, so I speak as a layman about money. I'll tell you my layman's ideas of what I believe the digital payment and currency system could be, and then Luca and others can Philippe and others can tell you what's the problem with that. There will be many problems, obviously. What we have seen in the world's financial system, financial services industry has grown massively. Their share of GDP and corporate profits has grown greatly, which many people believe is out of line with their. It's not a measure of how much welfare they add or bring to society. it's become a very large surplus rent extraction machine, actually.
Here, here.
And the original and useful and essential functions of financial intermediation by the banking system, which was essentially taking deposits and making loans by assessing loan applications, has largely been replaced. They still do those functions, of course they do, but most of the profits don't arise from that. Vast proportion of financial services industry profits come from trading. And I have not seen evidence for the welfare contributions of the industry in exchange for those trading profits that they make. Let me cut the story short. I think CBDC that Philippe and Luca just talked about is an excellent opportunity to not only use the electronic technology to reform and rationalize the payment system and share its advantages with the population at large, but also to restructure the financial services industry to return it to its basic economic functions in society of financial intermediation.
Yeah.
And I believe, perhaps wrongly, and Luca and Philippe will correct me on this, I've come to think that with introduction of CBDC, all deposits, and CBDC will allow a form of CBDC I'm talking about where central banks will allow not only wholesale accounts of corporate and financial service organizations, but also individuals. Each individual, any organization or individual can have a direct CBDC account with the central bank and deposit the money in there. But they would not be able to borrow on that. I mean, you can only withdraw your own money, won't have the borrowing privileges. This means all the deposits will move from commercial banks to the central bank. But the function of loan making will still stay with the commercial banks, for which they will have to borrow from the central bank, evaluate the loan applications, which only they can do. I don't think central bank can ever have the ability to evaluate the loan applications and decide who is to get the loan and at what interest rate. Let that basic function continue to be performed by the commercial banks, and they will earn their share of profits on that function by charging a premium according to the riskiness of the loan made. And the private banks will not have the money-making power. I'm talking about 100% reserve banking. So I'm not talking about fractional reserve banking, but return to 100% reserve banking. What money you need, borrow it from central bank, evaluate loan applications, hand out the loans, take the risk, collect your interest, make your profits. Okay? That is the thin bank that I think should we need to go back to What is the chance is going to happen? Yes, I see zero chance of that happening, unless a lot of academics who know better than me will argue for it. Because the commercial banks basically control the decision-making system of the central bank in the United States, maybe in the UK also. So they're going to prevent US Federal Reserve System from reformulating the payment system and the currency system in a way to eliminate this huge rent generation machine that they have created. Okay? And let the efficiencies of this new technology go to the public. What's going to be the result? The world will belong to China.
Thank you very much. Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. I will not try to summarize everything, but I think Philippe, as a former central bank, as an advocate for the central bank digital currency, I will not try to explain it again. And so we expect that, but there are some points about it. By this comparative analysis started with. And Luca has added and approached this very similar idea by concluding with the public-private arrangement and say that at the end, we don't need either monopoly or competition, because essentially money is not a commodity. So we don't really produce it in the same way. And so we have not to apply this sort of industrial organization idea to the main arrangement, the main regime. If we abandon this idea, we can come back to something which is a collective arrangement which requires trust and requires relations. And at that point, of course, the central bank will be a well-placed actor to do it. But Chavez, remember us, that should probably not do everything. So as I mentioned, okay, let's do the deposit management, because perhaps they are the best ways. When we started with the currency, it was similar. They were issuing notes, and we eventually centralized this monopoly of issuance. And so the banknote you have in your pocket is a similar idea. It could be just a sort of physical signal of an account that we already have. Technically speaking, they correspond to a liability of the central bank. So it would be like the notes that Luca were speaking about. You could imagine this even already in the system we have. But the lending is another story. And you go back to Hayek, and you can see that you need a special business connection, and you know to be involved in the social relation further, and of course power and political influence occur. So it would probably not be a very good idea to have just one big lender, controlling everything. Even in China, which they push the authorities so far, they are not trying to do that, and you will have a strong fight with, oligarchs and the power of people in society, which will never really want that. And this is also why historically this public-private arrangement occurred, because money is also about social forces and the power behind this purchasing power, which is created and managed. So again, this can be one point. And I think this morning was mentioned that corporate banking and mutualistic banking, Polanyi was mentioned. And it's such important to remember that if money is no longer a commodity, it's more something, an accounting system behind arranging social and financial relations, which we need for commerce, but also for investment. At that point, you can also imagine more friendly or way to do it, which are not depend on traditional banking, and definitely not require this kind of speculative trading Luca was referring to. But the problem is that in the last decades, we moved to a belief an arrangement which is completely based on this idea of market-based finance, to the point that we want to market everything, even public services. And at the end of the story, we have abusing of what the market can do and end up in something which is increasingly look like an authoritarian system, which is quite a paradox. So we started from having this idea of market as kind of free enterprise and so this intermediation, and we end up with top leading actors colluding with the top public actor and controlling everything through administrative decisions, which are beyond control, substantially even technical. So the situation is not that easy. So it was my remark just to open the debate and add to what we said this morning, what you have said now. I don't know, if you, the floor is here, I don't think we can manage having people online saying, but sure, Sean will say something, so I give you the floor, come here. Try to be short, like 5 minutes, if you can, so we can allow also other people, and the speaker will react at the end. We will probably take at least 10 minutes more because we started late, so we'll probably close a bit later than 4:15. Feel free to leave if you need.
I'd like to add some new thoughts. One, I completely agree. The financial system costs about over 20% of GDP. Last century, it was less than 5%. So you need to simplify money, you need to reinvent money and central banking. And what's not been mentioned is that market failure has created climate change. And rather than having carbon taxing or trading, what we need to do is have a monetary system which eliminates climate change and counter it by being tethered to an index of sustainability. And this is why I would not support any central bank as digital currency, because it is the cause of climate change. We've got to reinvent money to have it tethered. That's the problem with cryptocurrencies, that they try to tether to official money, but official money's not tethered to anything. Nobody's defined what economic value is. And the way it's being defined by markets is poisoning and degrading the world. So if we want to save humanity on this planet, we've got to keep it simple and just have money which is a medium of exchange, self-liquidating, like Keynes suggested in 1923, by having a negative interest rate which redeems the money, and that simplifies it. It's no longer a store of value or unit of account, and this goes back to history again, when you had a gold standard for the tether. And so you don't need central banking as we know it. Their only role would be establishing the tether, which automatically gives stability, and you'd have decentralized banking along the way that Shyam has been describing and what was done in history. So that's that's the points I'd like to make, and I'd like to get the response on that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, and one last thing. What I'm saying here, I said on a free online roundtable debate I organized in London last Thursday. It was chaired by the former Sheriff of London, Alderman Professor Michael Manelli, who will be the Lord Mayor next year. And I had Charles Goodhart and also William Bertier, who are both advisors to the Bank of England, in that roundtable. And also had Andrew Hilton, who's had the financial innovation. He headed up the financial studies and financial innovations, and you'll get a different mindset from the official advisors to the Bank of England, and they have a mindset of how things should be done, and you have some alternative views. So if you go to the Financial Service Club, Google's Financial Service Club, how should central bank conflicts be managed? And you'll get a 1 hour recording of this debate airing these sort of points. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Is that less than 5 minutes?
Yeah, it was 5 minutes. Do we have other remarks from you? You want to say something? But take the floor? No, you shy? Okay, so I will give you back.
I'm sure that if they want to ask questions through Zoom, they can do that.
Okay,
So maybe you can ask them,
sure.
they can just,
I don't know if the public can hear me, the public online. If someone wants, okay, we have Dave Elder. Can you talk? Let's try. Activate your. Hi.
Yes. Hello, thank you. Shall I ask my question now?
So please go ahead. 5 minutes. Give your remarks or ask some questions.
So thank you. Yes, I mean, really, I just have a question, and the question is, isn't it true that we already have predominantly digital currencies? I mean, it seems to me that cryptocurrencies have become quite significant as financial assets, but have really failed as payment systems. I mean, nobody uses Bitcoin to buy things. It's largely speculative as an asset. Stable coins even are not really of much interest to people outside the crypto community because their main use is as a kind of transactional safe haven for people who are trading crypto. So it strikes me that there's not really much of a threat from cryptocurrencies and stable coins to the financial system or to the conventional payment system at the moment. And in a sense, it seems like central banks are anticipating a threat that hasn't really materialized yet, and introducing a kind of digitalization of sections of the payment system which are really quite antiquated, which are resting on 19th or 20th century settlement systems, which make the settlement of some financial transactions very slow. But actually, most business transactions go through electronic banking, credit card payments, and so on already. And so perhaps it's quite a narrow niche that's being addressed by these central bank payment proposals, and one which is just a matter of catching up on settlement delays that aren't really necessary with a private, non-distributed digital payment system, which is what we have already for most of our business transactions. So isn't it true that we already have predominantly digital currencies, is my question.
Thank you. That's a very interesting point. Do you have other people online willing to contribute?
Well, I can make a question.
Oh, sure, please come to,
Okay.
to the...
I think it was a very interesting question, and it addressed issues that are very relevant for our time. Now, the case of Tesla, it was not just investing on Bitcoin. They were actually accepting the selling cars on Bitcoins. But due to the variability of the currency, this process only took about a month. Because then they invented some excuses like Bitcoin is against the environment, it spends a lot of energy and this kind of stuff to eliminate this possibility of trading with the Bitcoins, because the price of the cars in dollars will vary very much. Now, I think the separation between lending and deposits is quite useful for the digital currency that is issued by the central banks, and this will be a great transformation to the financial system if the deposits will be on the central bank and not on the commercial banks as it is now. But given the power that the financial system has currently, I fully agree that there was no way that they would accept this specifically. It would need to be great political change in order for this possibility to be implemented. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Should I take more? Okay, I think if I summarize, I think what Dave.
Could we get, is Philippe still on the line?
I hope so.
Get his reaction.
Sure. I will let the two of you reacting. So the point is quite straight. The point is essentially we have all this digital currency movement, the cryptocurrency in particular, but the only one who officially try to use as a current to do something more than speculative, self-fulfilling pricing and trade failed. So essentially, we have created something just like a giant casino, which is threatening financial stability because the financial actor, the older financial actors, start investing just because they speculate on everything. So they start even issuing derivative on cryptocurrencies and they speculate on everything. They can speculate on cryptocurrency too, you know. Okay, what's the point about having a financial system like data? I dare to ask. But again, this is not replacing or threatening the existing system. So I really want to have the three of you reacting on this. Okay, so Philippe first, we will follow the same order. Philippe, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Yeah, the discussion was quite rich, and I think a number of points were made. I think I'm more positive than most on digital currencies by central banks, because I think that digital currency makes very clear who gets which right. And in terms of deposits, it may be very, very useful. In terms also of making the lending easier, it might also be important. Because up to now, what we've seen without digital currency is that quantitative easing, for instance, was very difficult to achieve. Some people don't like that we lend as central bankers to the states. This is problematic, of course, but it's even more problematic when people who don't like to lend to the states don't want to lend to the private sector either. And they might have good reasons because they say, oh, why should central bank advantage A rather than B? Well, this is very difficult to answer if it's not done by the private sector, which also has a legitimacy, because they are going to bear the cost if they're not profitable enough. So behind the situation of central banks concerning digital currencies, you have several issues. One is payment systems. Would it improve very much the situation? Well, some would say yes, because what is very, very fast now is settlements between in the private sector, but not necessarily at the same speed between banks and between others. Others being non-banks, which are starting to compete very much with the banks. But why isn't it a perfect world, and why are the banks treated differently from non-banks when it's about liquidity? It's not clear very much either. So I think that there would be a much better occasion to compare the situation of various types of agents if we were under digital currencies. Well, this leads me to the point of Shan, who was very opposed to having a system by which central bank have a digital currency.
No.
Because he was in favor of the sustainability vis-a-vis climate change. Well, I'm also in favor of sustainability vis-a-vis climate change, but I don't know who knows better on climate change. Is it the central banks? Is it the states? Who? So I think there too we have a real problem of governance, and this has to be solved. Maybe digital currencies are not a solution, but I think it has to be solved anyway. I don't know if I've answered full set of issues, but you will tell me if not.
Okay, thank you. Luca?
Yep.
You want me to explain?
So thank you, all of you, for your questions, and thank you, Sham, for your remarks. I will start from there by saying that essentially I agree with you. I mean, I do see as a form of this public-private partnership that I envisaged, the possibility of dividing tasks along the lines that you suggested, with the central bank issuing the currency and managing the payment system, and the private banks doing what they do best, which is to allocating credit, because of course you don't want to centralize this unless you really are nostalgic of the Soviet Union, and you don't want to leave the payment system to private banks that will then have to be bailed out whenever they make other mistakes, simply because they are performing a public function. So I think this makes sense. We can refine it, but as a starting point, it makes sense to go along these lines. There is a proposal, by the way, that goes in this direction by Ulrich Binzeil. And there is another paper. I think I am proposing this to Yuri for the review. I think we should do a special issue on, I think, the most interesting paper I have read on central bank digital currencies by Saule Omarova. This woman was almost appointed the controller of the currency in the United States, but then stepped back precisely because she was making these provocative proposals. And she speaks of a public-private franchise. So she doesn't use the word partnership, franchise to express, in view of a democratization of money and the financial system. She says central bank digital currencies are an opportunity to bring back banks to. So I will send you the link to that, and maybe we can start our discussion from there. Turning to Shan's remark, Shan Turnbull, right? I believe we met. And in fact, we met in Madrid, where I was presenting a paper along the lines of Keynes's proposal at Bretton Woods. So I can only share your concern, and I like the provocation. It's true that central bank currencies are at the root of many of our present problems, and that Keynes has something to say about what we should peg the money to, when at Bretton Woods he was proposing not just the clearing union, but the common control, suggesting that you don't want to get back to the gold standard, but you want to peg the currency to a basket of commodities that are primary goods in international trade and in productive processes. I think that's an interesting perspective. Not only that, I have the uneasy feeling that China is already moving in that direction, because in the wake of the war and of the sanctions, we have seen Russia facing, of course, the sanctions and not being able to sell her gas and oil. So she was selling this to whoever was willing to buy it. and China, of course, is one. And there was this report by Credit Suisse that was suggesting precisely this, that China is shifting from exchange reserves to energy reserves as a way of backing its currency. And if China does that unilaterally, I think we are in trouble, because this would really fragment further the international monetary system, leaving China with control over international trade and commodities, and perhaps the United States with an international currency that serves only the purposes of finance, which is not a division that we would like to encourage. So I am really sympathetic with this perspective of taking the opportunity of central bank digital currencies, and there are already initiatives in terms of multi-currency, wholesale, transnational digital currencies. So there's an initiative by China together with Saudi Arabia under the auspices of the Bank for International Settlements. They are experimenting with this. I think that this is also an opportunity to reform the international monetary system. It's another of the jobs that we have left behind. And I think we should get back on that as well. To Dave and Yuri's question, don't we already have predominantly digital currencies? Well, we do in part of the world. We do in the West. We do in advanced economies. It's a problem even there, because we have instability, and we have bailouts and moral hazard. Go back to my first slide, because of the fact that we have handed over to the private banking system a lot of different tasks. But the fact that we need something different is particularly evident in the periphery. And I think Philippe was suggesting this in his presentation. In countries where we have exchange rate instability, where we have capital controls, where we have financial exclusion, where transnational payments cost a lot, you need a digital currency. So you have in the world 1.7 billion people who are unbanked. You have international transfers, so remittances from migrants that cost on average 6.8%. There's clearly room for some innovation. We can't say that the digital currencies today are efficient. And this is the reason why Facebook wanted to step into this market, because they saw a market opportunity.
Even Visa and MasterCard transactions, 2 or 3% is ridiculous.
It's ridiculous. So this is the reason why there's room for innovation. And already in the periphery, you see that, apart from the case of Salvador, where they adopted Bitcoin as a legal tender, but Venezuela is another case where people are using Bitcoin because they have capital controls, because they have low energy costs, and because it's more advantageous than the local currency. So I think there is room to go in that direction, and I think that we should not leave it to these initiatives that have been mainly speculative, and this I agree with Dave so far.
Sean, have the last word.
No,
Okay, yeah, so we have already
5 minutes more, yeah.
Yeah, so okay, let's just close the session now. I want to thank once more all the questions, all the presenters, for this amazing debate. And we definitely not the last time we will talk about money, banking, credit in our journal and in this annual conference we run with the SASE. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yuri.
Thank you.
I will have the last word. Thank you. Let's thank Yuri for doing all
I've sent all of you an email.
Sure, yeah, send the
with my
Thanks, Sean.
for the thing. I'm sorry I didn't recognize you. But,
It's been a while.
it's been a while, and old men can't remember too well. If Yuri's doing a